Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood, coming up on the show. Former FBI Director James Comey shares his insights on the upcoming US election, the presidential candidates, and the future of American democracy. With personal ties to Gaza, Scotland's former First Minister Humza Yousaf shares his thoughts on the humanitarian challenges in Palestine and the role of the international community in brokering peace. As Israel shows no sign of reaching a ceasefire deal, I speak to the UK former Minister of State for the Middle East for his reaction to the conflict. Well, to the US election now, where the majority of Americans will go to the polls in just about 5 weeks to decide who will become the 47th president of the United States. As we approach the election, with Donald Trump once again a major contender and Kamala Harris playing a prominent role as vice president, with polls indicating a tight race. Well, earlier I spoke to former FBI Director James Comey to get his insights into the state of democracy, the security of the electoral process, and the future of American politics. Sir, thank you for your time, Mr. Comey. Look, this is the second book in a trilogy that you're writing, as far as I understand. I think the first question to ask, for those who know you as James Comey, former director of the FBI, is what's led you to crime writing?
The nudging and pushing of the editors of my nonfiction work. They said I ought to give it a try. I resisted. They pushed. I resisted, then finally decided to try, and I've found it addictive. The chance to show people some of the worlds I've known through fiction, but with a very real sense of how things work. It's been fun. What
do you think your editors saw in you that they thought, you know what, James is going to write some great fiction work for us?
Well, they said that I wrote narrative well and I wrote dialogue well. They kept referring to things that had happened in my actual life as scenes, and I kept telling them, these aren't scenes, this is my life. But they said you ought to try because you're able to write in a way that people find interesting. And so far, so good. This is what I want to do when I grow up.
Very good. Well, truth is stranger than fiction, as the saying goes, and you've certainly experienced a lot. Let's stick with the books for a moment, because you called your first one Central Park West. This one is called Westport. Those are places, are they places that resonate with you?
Yes, they're places that I've worked and investigated and know well. And so in the first one, which is mostly focuses on political corruption and the mafia, two things I spent a lot of time grappling with as a federal prosecutor, I wanted to put people in the neighborhoods that I know. And the same thing with Westport. It's based in a financial management firm, a hedge fund. I happened to work at one for 3 years before I became FBI director in a place called Westport.
You did, indeed. Your time at that hedge fund has actually been chronicled in a very interesting article by, I think, Vanity Fair recently. You were the in-house counsel there?
Yes, I was the chief lawyer.
Interesting. Look, in terms of catharsis, do you think you're getting some from this now? You've mentioned already, sort of nudgingly, winkingly perhaps, that some of the experiences you've had, some people would call scenes. They're so strange. Do you think there's some sort of therapeutic thing to writing them down now as fiction?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, for me, mostly what I enjoy is to take people inside the worlds that I, in this weird journey of my life, have been inside. Federal prosecutors, the FBI, the world's largest hedge fund. But again, do it through fiction so people don't think I'm writing a secret biography of a place I was. And that frees me up to show people the way it really is. In an odd sense, fiction is freeing. And I think it's exciting without me having to make up stuff. A lot of fiction has people like the FBI director jumping out of helicopters. That doesn't happen. But there's a lot of excitement in the work without making things up.
Would anybody from your previous life, in your role as FBI director, or even from your hedge fund days, recognize themselves as a character in any of your books?
They're all trying to see if they're in there.
I bet they are.
I've told them, dude, you're not in there. But I've taken pieces of people and combined them to create characters. And I've told friends what parts of them they can look for in what characters, but I'm not going to say that publicly.
Look, you previously have said it was never your goal to become famous, and that's probably understandable, being, you know, with your former prosecutorial background, law enforcement, but you became director of the FBI, so you knew you were going to get this major platform. But you then became more famous, of course, with the presidency of Donald Trump, and of course we'll come on to that. But is this your way of now using this platform despite not ever having wanted to be famous?
Maybe a little. I mean, obviously the advantage that the publishers see in having my name on the cover is that people might recognize the name and pick up the book and read it. But they're only going to keep reading if the books are good, and I think they are. I mean, I guess it's easy for me to say I'm the author, but in part, sure, the identity gives me a leg up over folks who are less well known.
What's it been like entering the world of publishing from the kind of career that you had? I mean, you had a bit of a pause, assuming, you know, post your big public role, post DC, time to come down, and then you've entered publishing. What's that been like?
It's been fun because I'm a bit of an introvert, and it allows me to work alone. I spend a lot of my time just sitting on my back porch, writing on a laptop, and to use my family to help me write better. My wife is my partner in this, gives me awesome feedback and ideas, and so do all 5 of my kids. So that's made it a family affair and a quiet one, which I've really enjoyed.
That sort of sings to me, you saying you're an introvert, because I am too, and people often think, well, how can you be that way if you're a news anchor? They probably thought that way. How can you be that way when you're when you were the director of the FBI? So what would be your answer to that, how an introvert operates in that type of role?
I heard somebody say that describe themselves as a socially adept introvert, and that's kind of what I am. Is I can do it, and I have to do it. I have to shake hands. I have to talk to a lot of people when I'm FBI director. But maybe it fits better for an introvert because you don't crave the attention. You don't get energy from the exposure. I used to have to go home at the end of the day and just stare at a tree after a long day as FBI director. And so maybe that's healthier than some of the people we see in public life who are hungry for affirmation and feed on it. Introverts don't. I know you get this, but people who aren't introverts probably don't realize how little you crave the attention.
Oh, you're telling me you're going home to stare at a white wall generally and blocking everything out just to reset for the next day. What's it been like then, stepping out of that introvert bubble, if you like, that recovery from that public profile, and now doing news interviews about your book, about your writing, but also, I suppose, going on book tours and doing signings?
Yeah, I do it because it's necessary. And I also enjoy the interactions with individual readers who have liked the books and want more. And I've actually just signed a deal to write book 4 and book 5. I'd originally thought it would be a trilogy, but it's done well enough. The publisher wants at least 5 focused on my protagonist, Nora Carlton. So I've enjoyed those interactions. I still have to go and stare at something at a blank wall, like you said. But my favorite part is the part that people can't see, where I am alone or just talking to my wife or kids about how to make a chapter or a sentence better.
What do your kids make of the books?
They were cringing, as they would say, at the idea of me getting out there and writing these books. They've enjoyed them. They've helped make them better. They know that I've tried in my protagonist to take pieces of my kids and combine them into a character that I can close my eyes and not only love, but picture. And so they've helped me keep that right. They've helped me with the details. They've helped me with the language. So they feel part of it in a way that I think is good and fun.
And you've also written, you know, female characters, very well-rounded kind of in the world female characters. Do you think your background, FBI background, had something to do with that? Obviously, FBI profiling, that type of thing. I'm not likening women here to serial killers, of course. But that type of thing, getting in the mind, the psychology of other types of people, do you think that's helped you sort of write for a woman?
I don't think the FBI helped me with that. I think being married to an amazing person who's also trained as a marriage and family therapist, I should add, not because of me, but because of her broader interest in helping, especially children. And in a household of 5, 4 of whom were girls, I've learned a lot and learned to see the world in a different way than just being trapped in this person that you're talking to today. So I don't think it was the FBI. I think it was sort of the training that began for me when I met my wife in 1980.
How lovely. Look, I know You've described it as icky, and I know it's an icky topic, but of course we can't speak to you, Mr. Comey, with the oncoming US election without talking about politics, without talking about DC. You have described it as icky in the past. So how engaged do you stay with what's actually happening on Capitol Hill?
Only as much as I have to. I follow it because I think especially the presidential election is really important. I know we always say the most important of our lifetimes. This feels like that label really finally fits with the upcoming election. So I follow it. I try to find ways if I can be useful. I've contributed money to Kamala Harris. And so I follow it as much as I need to. I would love not to follow it at all. And if Harris is elected president, it'll be much easier to do that.
You feel you'll be able to sort of check out a bit, feeling like it's going to be in safe hands in your mind anyway, because you say that you've donated to her campaign, you've endorsed her, you publicly came out and endorsed her, and you said it felt like it's finally, quote, morning in America. What did you mean by those words?
I really feel a sense that something has been uncorked in our country with the stepping aside of President Biden and the emergence of this exciting, charismatic person committed to the rule of law. I think there's an excitement that we haven't felt in this country since 2008. And I think part of the excitement is a hunger that Americans have just to get beyond the nastiness and the name calling and all the horribleness that comes with Donald Trump and his social media. I think people are maybe not his core, that's not going to change, but most Americans just want to get onto something different. And that's what I meant by saying it finally feels like it's morning in America. And I'm increasingly optimistic about what's going to happen in November.
It will be interesting to see, because we're hearing this narrative, sometimes this pushback against what some people are calling that kind of hate narrative. In the UK, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British. We've just had the general election there in the summer, and some people were wondering whether the Conservatives would hold on to the government because they were doing that kind of what we call gutter politics, kind of sinking to the low blows. And the opposition, Labour, who eventually came into power with Keir Starmer, always said they were going to take the high ground and not go low like that. But ultimately, they did come in with a few digs. Do you think Harris appointing Waltz as her sort of running mate has helped her kind of get that toughness, but also that approachability, something about not being too removed and too elitist anymore?
I think she's a plenty tough person, given her background. I don't think that's where she needed to shore herself up. I think what she's done by picking Governor Walz is appeal to a broad swath in the middle of this country that often feels overlooked, especially by the Democratic Party. And he's someone who can speak plainly, who can talk about issues in a way that makes people smile, but also resonates. His incantation, mind your own business, really resonates with Americans, especially in the Midwest. And so I think it was a very smart pick. And also, they're both people who are radiating joy and happiness. And that's, Americans, we're complicated people, but at our core, we want to have fun. We want to embrace joy. And I think that's part of what they've tapped into.
In terms of the trajectory of US politics, you've made a very clear statement there already. You do think this actually is a completely pivotal election. Is that because you imagine things turning a certain way if Donald Trump was to regain presidency?
I think if Donald Trump became president again, it would be very bad for all kinds of reasons in the short run. It would also delay the cleansing that we need to get to a place where we have two healthy political parties in the United States. I think with his defeat, which again, I'm optimistic about, the Republican Party will begin what will be a long process of getting to a healthier place and actually representing ideas and proposals and becoming a healthy antagonist for the Democratic Party.
I mean, you talk about that two-horse race, that healthy two-party system, as you just sort of described it. We have had, obviously, independents running in this election, RFK Jr. being one of them, and he actually stopped being an independent in order to endorse Trump. Do you think it will always be a two-party system?
It will. Ours is set up with the way we have a winner-take-all system to drive people to organize their coalitions into two parties. It'll always be that way. We'll have a variety of third-party candidates. As this year, you'll have some wingnuts running as third-party candidates. But in the main, it'll always be two parties. And so we need them both to be active and healthy. And it's okay that they fight about important policy issues, but they have to be committed to the things that are really aren't susceptible to partisan division, the rule of law, peaceful transition of power. Those are the things that we're supposed to have as our bedrock, which is why any Republican ought to be voting for the Democrat this time, because there's only one candidate running for election in the United States in November who's committed to a peaceful transition of power and the rule of law, the bedrock of our society.
And hey, look, Mr. Comey, I think it behooves us at this point to remind viewers watching this that you were actually a lifelong Republican. And listening to you saying that, some people might be confused otherwise, but you were up until the point of Donald Trump. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a registered Republican, and I served in the George W. Bush administration as U.S. attorney and then as the number 2 at the Justice Department. President Obama then asked me to be the FBI director because that's a role that's traditionally outside of politics. But really nobody committed to the things I just mentioned, to the rule of law and to our Constitution, can be a supporter of Donald Trump. And frankly, I don't see how they can be call themselves a Republican these days.
So the grand old party, the GOP, has gone in your mind. Is there a way for it to come back in any way, or is the Republicans now the party of Trump and whoever succeeds him afterwards?
Well, it will have to change because they can't win elections. They can't get above the high watermark of 47% of the American voters supporting them. And so that's not sustainable in the long run to be a minority party. So circumstances will force them to change to get to a healthier place where they can attract the support of a majority of Americans. So that's why in the long run, we'll be okay. We will get to that place, but getting there will be much faster after Donald Trump loses in November.
Well, you say that with some conviction, but at the moment, whilst we're speaking, Harris is only polling just a few points ahead nationwide, and those swing states are still looking like she could lose out to Trump. And obviously those swing states, some say, that is where the election is going to be made. If Trump wins, and you've already touched upon this, you're talking there about law and order and what it means for the country, but what would another Trump presidency look like in your eyes?
I think it would be a bit of a nightmare in a way. I mean, there's a reason that so many members of his own cabinet have not only not endorsed him, but have said this guy should be nowhere near the Oval Office. Donald Trump as president again will be unconstrained in lots of ways, including by not having people around him. He didn't have all-stars the first time. This time he'll have the very bottom of the American barrel, and there are bottom barrel dwellers who would want jobs there. But what the first group did was actually thwart him in a lot of ways, ignore him, cajole him, play him along. The next group around him will not do that. And so all the nutty things, the ideas of shooting protesters in the legs or ordering the prosecution of individuals, those kinds of things that are antithetical to our system, there won't be anybody around Donald Trump to tell him, forget that, or to distract him with a shiny object and then take the memo from his desk. And so you're looking at an administration where he will be able to do the crazy things that so frightened people the first time.
Do you have concerns about another January 6th type event? Probably not replicated, heaven forbid, but in terms of, you know, that type of social media kind of furor, those types of organizations, you know, people organizing and coming together like that again?
I don't. I'm quite worried about individual violence and the epidemic of threats that comes from MAGA world directed at public officials, at the misguided people acting on those threats and individual acts of violence, which are very serious, taking place. I'm not worried about the large scale January 6th type violence because a message has been sent over the last 4 years with the prosecution of more than 1,000 people for January 6th. The message is your life will be ruined if you engage in that kind of conduct. And the people who would be tempted to are not jihadis looking to lay down their lives for the orange god king. These are people with families, with jobs, with homes, with assets. They don't want to light their lives on fire for Donald Trump. And so that message has been sent. And it's the reason there aren't crowds at any of his court appearances. He's unable to summon that kind of violence because a really important and positive message of deterrence has been sent.
Now, you brought up there his court appearances, of course, multiple ongoing court cases, some civil, some criminal. He is a convicted felon. How do you feel as a former FBI director watching somebody who is a convicted person running for presidency?
If you put it in a book proposal for a crime thriller, your publisher would reject it as fanciful. It's not, come on, come on, someone running for president who's a convicted felon. Well, that's the world in which we live. So it's bizarre. It feels like a dream, but it's a reality. It's going to be a close election when one of the candidates lied about the last election, incited his followers to sack the United States Capitol during the transfer of power, and has subsequently been convicted of multiple felonies. But that's the weird place in which America finds itself. And as I said, I am optimistic that it is morning in America and we're going to put that behind us. But it's very, very important for people who care about things like the rule of law to get out there and participate in this election.
And, you know, in previous months when I've been covering his court cases, I've been interviewing people from the Republican Party and Trump supporters who've talked, of course, about what they call lawfare, which is this idea that the justice system is being weaponized to prevent him from running for president or to put him behind bars. And there was original discussion about that galvanizing his base, making his support more strong. Do you think that theory still holds?
Yes. And it's at the heart of his famous line about, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and not lose supporters. And the reason for that is just sort of the nature of fraud victims. Is I've done cases where the victims of a fraudster came to his sentencing after he had admitted his guilt to speak on his behalf, because it's very, very hard for people to turn away, to admit what they'd have to admit about themselves when they turn away from a candidate. And if January 6th didn't cause Trump supporters to turn, I don't know what would turn the core group. Human beings just can't take the kind of pain that requires the admission about yourself and how you were fooled and a fool. So it doesn't surprise me that his legal troubles have bound a lot of people more tightly to him. That's just the way humans work.
Will we see him behind bars at any point?
I think there's a real possibility of that. I think it's actually a possibility he's going to get a jail sentence on September the 18th in Manhattan. And when he would serve that and how that will work exactly, they'll have to sort out. But if convicted of the federal offenses, he's going to get a jail sentence unless if President Biden pardons him or future President Harris pardons him. So, yes, I think there's a significant likelihood that he will end up in jail.
It will be extraordinary scenes if we see that. Look, I just want to round off this interview. You've been very generous with your thoughts and your time, but by asking you potentially now more as a writer than in your former role as FBI Director, but about information sources and what you trust now when it comes to the sort of public debate, the narrative, obviously social media, there's attacks on mainstream media. What do you look to?
I try to triangulate. That is to get information from a variety of sources and see them collide, because out of the collision of views comes the best view of the truth. It's the magic of a Wikipedia, for example. So many minds coming together gives us a rough approximation of what's true. So I try not to rely just on one news source to give me a picture of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Comey. When's your third book coming out?
Coming out in May, and I'm hard at work on number 4. That's where my head is now.
Excellent. We'll let you get back to your writing desk. James Comey, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Israel's war on Gaza has killed at least 41,500 Palestinians and wounded at least 96,000, according to the latest figures released on Thursday by the health ministry there. More than half of the dead have been women and children, including about 1,300 babies and toddlers under the age of 2. Israeli forces have repeatedly struck schools, alleging Hamas uses them as command centers to plan attacks. The Palestinian group has denied the charges. Well, my next guest has been a vocal advocate for humanitarian issues, in particular the ongoing crisis in Gaza. As the first Muslim leader of a Western government, Humza Yousaf's personal connection to the region runs deep, with his in-laws previously trapped in Gaza giving him a unique and heartfelt perspective on the conflict. Humza Yousaf, thank you, sir, for your time. Let's begin with the issue at hand, Gaza, because you are deeply connected to this story through your wife, of course, and her family. And I want to begin by asking, how are they?
Well, that's very kind of you to ask. Most of my wife's family have managed to leave Gaza, but unfortunately not all of them. And her cousin, Sally, her 4 children, and her husband, we haven't heard from for, I think, now 5 days. They were in Dirbala. Dirbala was told to evacuate to a safe zone near Al-Mawasi, and of course there is no such thing as a safe zone in Gaza. We know that from the atrocities that have been committed by the Israeli government thus far. And I'm afraid we don't know where Sally, her 4 children, and her husband are. We pray for their safety. But this is just one story. Of course, there are millions of people, and therefore millions of families across the world worried about their loved ones in Gaza. And I think even if you don't have a human connection in the way that I do, and a family connection in the way that my wife and I do, then still people are rightly angered, upset at the scale of the atrocity that we see the people of Gaza are suffering from.
Now, you've clearly used your platform as a major working politician and as the former First Minister of Scotland over previous months to talk about Gaza, to talk about what is happening there for Palestinian people. But you've also come under criticism from some saying, in their opinion, that you're failing to be, you're too partisan because you're too closely connected to the issue. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is pretty simple, that it's really clear that this is an issue of international law. You don't have to be pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, you just have to be pro-international law. To say that unequivocally, as I did, that there was no justification for the terrible crimes that were committed on October the 7th, and at the same time, nothing, of course, can justify killing innocent Gazans, innocent children, innocent men and innocent women, collectively punishing them. 40,000, we know now, Gazans have been killed, not died, have been killed by the Israeli government. So I'm a believer in the equitable and equal application of international law. And that must apply, of course, to state parties and non-state parties equally. And we have, with Israel, a Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, where there is an arrest warrant from the ICC being sought. So therefore, in my opinion, we should be treating those who are breaching international law in an equal manner, whether they are a terrorist organisation or whether they are the head of a government.
Look, I'm glad you brought up the ICC because there are reports that your wife's family is preparing evidence from their time spent trapped in Gaza to present to the ICC. Is that still going ahead, and what outcome do you hope for?
Yes, I mean, the ICC themselves, the prosecutors involved, have been asking those with eyewitness testimony to come forward. And just to give you an example of some of the eyewitness testimony from my mother-in-law, they were in their house in Dirbala in Gaza. This was in late October, and the blast occurred. And when the dust literally settled on that blast, they went outside, and there was an 8-year-old girl lying in their front garden who had broken her spine. She had been lifted in the air many metres high and landed in their front garden with, as I say, a broken spine, completely paralysed. That's just one example of the many things that my mother-in-law and father-in-law saw, and therefore it's right that we compile that testimony, collate it, and present it to the International Criminal Court. And it is for the International Criminal Court, the judges, to decide whether an arrest warrant should be granted or not. But I hope every single person, as I say, state or non-state party, that commits egregious breaches of international law must be held to account. Otherwise, international law is completely and utterly meaningless.
How much hope do you have for that international law, the process being followed through then, and Netanyahu being held to account for those crimes that you're talking about?
Look, I have to believe, and I can understand why people don't believe that international law is applied equally. Let's be frank here. It seems from the international community's response to Gaza that Palestinian lives are cheaper, that Palestinian blood is cheap. That is the view from many people, not just Muslims, not just those in the East, but many people believe that to be the case, given how we deal with, for example, egregious breaches of international law in Ukraine, and I fully support the people in the government of Ukraine, versus how we deal with egregious breaches of international law in Gaza. There is a double standard, a hypocrisy, which is very evident for many people to see. So international law has to mean something, and therefore, if there is an ICC arrest warrant granted by the judges of the International Criminal Court, then it must be upheld. That means if the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, does land in UK soil, then it's important that he is immediately arrested.
Now, look, in terms of the way forward from here, and I know it's early for some to even begin thinking of that, but certainly among countries and governments in the Middle East, there's been more activity in recent weeks and months to try and find some sort of sustainable solution between Israel and Palestine. What to you does sustainable coexistence look like?
Well, it's a good question. So there is the immediate, and in the immediate, there must, of course, be a ceasefire. We need that ceasefire so that, of course, the remaining hostages are released, and, of course, then that the humanitarian aid gets completed and unfettered access into Gaza, and the violence and the massacre and the killing of innocent Gazan people stops immediately. So that's why, in the immediate term, we need that ceasefire. In the more longer term, in terms of a sustainable future, I want to see a two-state solution. I'm a believer in the two-state solution. A viable, safe, secure Palestinian state alongside a safe, secure Israel. That is what the two-state solution must deliver. But the hypocrisy from many governments, including, I'm afraid, the United Kingdom government, is that they recognise one state, so they recognise the state of Israel, but they refuse to recognise the state of Palestine. That's unjustifiable. That is hypocritical. That, to me, does not show somebody who's honest, or a government that's honest, about trying to find a long-term sustainable solution. So if you believe in a two-state solution, if you believe in peace in that region, then you must immediately recognise the state of Palestine, as Ireland, Norway and Spain have done so recently.
The two words keep cropping up in our conversation, one being hypocrisy and the other being hope. Hypocrisy, in your mind, seems to be winning out a little bit in terms of the way things are sorted out. But what about hope then? Do you think there is any hope for that two-state solution within the next few years?
I do. I actually think this is probably a critical turning point. I think many people across the world, many who understandably did not know much about the terrible atrocities happening under occupation for the people of Palestine, have now woken up. They've seen the horrific images that we've all witnessed over the last 10 months. So I do think this is a critical juncture. I think this is a turning point. And I think there is inevitability about the recognition, global recognition of the Palestinian state, but it has to be immediate. The world has promised now for many decades that there will be an equal Palestinian state coexisting alongside the state of Israel. They have turned their back on that promise for far too many decades, but I believe it's now only a matter of time until there is that global recognition of the Palestinian state. And I'm talking to you, of course, from Scotland in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom government must stop wasting any more time and must immediately recognise the state of Palestine. To do otherwise, as I say, is hypocrisy, or paying lip service, and merely lip service, to your support of a two-state solution.
What do you make of the UK government's policy towards this conflict so far? Of course, we had a change of government in the UK over the summer, but do you think they're making the right decisions when it comes to this conflict?
So the previous Conservative government was, I'm afraid, complicit in my mind, because not only did they give almost unequivocal backing to the government of Israel, regardless of what atrocities were committed, but of course the UK government was sending arms and continues to send arms to Israel. So when it comes to the current United Kingdom government, the new government, the Labour government that is now in charge, there have been some stronger statements in regards to the situation in Gaza, but there's two issues that remain unresolved. One is the UK government continues to sell arms. There has to be a complete ban, a complete suspension of arms sales to Israel. There's talk of a partial suspension. There must be a complete suspension of arms sales to Israel. And the second issue, as we've already discussed, must be the immediate recognition of the state of Palestine. There's no need to wait for some mythical process that might exist in the future. If you already recognise the state of Israel, you must complete the other side of the equation and recognise the state of Palestine, as our neighbours in Ireland have done, our neighbours in Spain, our neighbours in Norway have done.
It is something to note exactly that those countries surrounding the UK have made that decision. The UK still holding out. Look, UK not the only one having an election in this historic election year. The US, of course, holding an election in November. We don't know, of course, who's going to be in the White House. Could it be Harris? Could it be Trump? But what do you think that could mean for the situation in Gaza?
Well, again, I think it's actually the American people that will drive forward change in the United States. I was heartwarmed, I have to say, to see many, many months ago now, when American Jews were the ones who occupied Central Station in New York demanding a ceasefire. It was the American Jewish community that occupied Congress and demanded a ceasefire. So it is the people of the United States who undoubtedly will be the conscience for their government. They will be the ones who I hope will drive that change. And the United States, of course, one of, if not arguably the most powerful geopolitical player in the globe. I think it's really important that they uphold international law. When we saw the interventions from the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, I was aghast when they had members of Congress threatening to sanction the International Criminal Court. Look, the international law has to mean something, and therefore it has to be applied equally and equitably. We can't pick and choose who international law applies to and who it doesn't apply to. So I would urge whoever is the next president of the United States, and that will clearly be a matter for the American people, to make sure that when it comes to its geopolitical stance, that it's driven by humanity, by compassion, and by the upholding of international law.
Now, you already mentioned Ukraine as part of the discussion, and you have said recently you want support for Ukraine to remain steadfast from the United Kingdom, I'm assuming, but also from the US, from the Western Allied forces. But what do you make then of Ukraine's recent push into Russia? How has this changed things?
Well, for me, there is a Russian war of aggression that has been waged against the people and the government of Ukraine. And for me, the situation is pretty simple. The people of Ukraine are also fighting for Europe's freedom and for our freedom. I've met many Ukrainian families here in Scotland forced to leave their home due to that war of aggression from the Russians. And of course, the Ukrainians have every right to defend themselves and to fight back. Let's make no mistake about it, it is Vladimir Putin that has waged this war of aggression, as he did, of course, many years ago when annexing Crimea. So I make no apology about my stances at all. I always look at these issues through the lens of international law, as I've said to you already, and there's no justification, none, for Vladimir Putin waging this war of aggression. So we need Vladimir Putin to be held to account for that, for the annexation of land and for the war that he's waged in Ukraine.
Indeed, Mr. Yousaf, you've made no apologies throughout your career, in fact, for voicing your strong policy positions, your opinions, not only within the government, but also on social media. So I hope that while we've got you for this discussion, you don't mind us touching on this topic, because it brought you to even bigger acclaim recently when you ended up in this online spat with the world's richest man, tech billionaire Elon Musk, who branded you, and I know you're aware of this, a super racist in his words, quote, and that you loathe white people. You in response called him a dangerous race baiter. Did you ever think you'd end up in that position?
Well, actually, it's not the first time I've challenged wealthy billionaires, and I'll make it very clear to Elon Musk that his billions will never buy me off. He'll never be able to silence me, and for calling out what his support for white supremacy. And that had devastating consequences here in the United Kingdom. Let's rewind back a few weeks when that tragic killing in Southport took place. It was a tragic killing of three beautiful souls that took place, and immediately in the aftermath of that devastating attack, there was disinformation and misinformation being spread that the individual involved was a Muslim, was a migrant. Of course, it turned out neither of those things was true. But that disinformation was amplified, not just in social media, but the disinformation amplified in the days after that by Elon Musk himself. Now, he is, in my view, a sympathiser of not just the far right, but of white supremacy. And if he thinks with his billions he can get me to be quiet, or he can shut me up, he can think again.
Well, he did, in fact, say these words to his some nearly 200 million followers. Did that make you consider legal recourse, some kind of official reprimand? Would you do that?
Well, look, there's always the legal avenue that's open to us, but I've always said, from my perspective, I'm happy to debate and challenge Elon Musk. Perhaps you can moderate that debate. I'm more than happy to debate him anytime, any place, anywhere. Like him, I believe in free speech, but free speech is not absolute. It has its limits, and you cannot incite violence in the way that Elon Musk has and not expect there to be any consequences. And let's be frank about it, and research has been done into this since Elon Musk took over Twitter, now of course X. It has had a proliferation of right-wing, far-right accounts unleashed upon it, and that has, as I say, very dangerous consequences indeed.
And that, of course, has been an even bigger topic with the recent arrest of Pavel Durov, the head of Telegram in France, and, European governments trying to work out their approach to law and free speech as well. So do you think governments should have a role in regulating social media?
They must. They absolutely must. Look, I'm an advocate of free speech, but free speech is, as I say, not absolute. We cannot go into a packed theatre and shout fire, and therefore the panic that ensues thereafter, people could get killed. Nobody advocates for absolute no limits whatsoever on free speech. There must be an element of regulation on social media, and my challenge to the United Kingdom government is that they must take firmer steps to punish those who incite violence and racism on social media platforms. And by the way, I get it every single day, frankly. I get abusive messages, racist messages, Islamophobic messages, death threats towards me and my family on various social media platforms, but primarily on X. So there has to be some level of regulation. The current levels are simply not good enough.
Now let's just finish up by talking about leaving, or whether you remain in that fight, because you've talked in the past about potentially leaving the United Kingdom. Is that true? Is that something that you would consider?
Look, I don't want to leave Scotland. Scotland is my home. I was born here, raised here, raising my beautiful 3 girls here. I wouldn't want to leave Scotland, but the truth of the matter is, particularly since the race riots that took place in the United Kingdom, and there wasn't any in Scotland, but the ones that took place across other parts of the United Kingdom, has meant that every single Muslim that I know and that I've spoken to, and this applies to me, is wondering, will my children be safe here in the future? My children are beautiful mixed-race children of Scottish, Palestinian, Pakistani heritage. Can I say truthfully that in the future they're going about their business, walking the streets, going to a friend's house, going to the mosque, for example, that they will be safe from attack or from reprisal? I can't truthfully say that with any certainty, and that's why so many of us, in fact every single Muslim I think, is virtually questioning whether or not they have a safe future here in the United Kingdom or not.
And it's a hard thing to draw parallels between feelings of safety or the reality of safety in the real world and that of online. But there is some sort of parallel to be drawn with remaining or leaving X, formerly Twitter, as well, because you've ended up in a situation, you say you receive abuse daily. Plenty of politicians in the UK have considered or have indeed left X in recent weeks and months, organisations, journalists, because they feel they can't responsibly be there anymore. Again, do you think it's more responsible to leave or to remain and try and change things?
Look, I can see the arguments both ways, I have to say, but look, I was on X for many, many years before Elon Musk took it over when it was Twitter. Don't get me wrong, I think it's always had some significant challenges with those who harass and abuse people. But I frankly think Elon Musk should be the one that should leave it, given that he's turned it into an absolute vile cesspit. And at the same time, if everybody who leaves it that is progressive, that is making the argument for common humanity, then of course it's just left to those who will peddle far-right conspiracy theories and white supremacy, and I don't think that's a very healthy platform. So I can completely understand the argument, but look, I'll stay on X and I'll keep challenging Elon Musk. As I say, his billions definitely can't force me off that platform and can't shut me up.
So for now, we'll continue to see you there on X, and we'll continue to see you there in Scotland and in the UK. Look, Humza Yousaf, it's been a pleasure speaking. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The conflict with Hezbollah has seen hundreds killed and more than 1,500 people injured since Israel launched its initial attacks on September 7th. But what is the history behind these tensions between Hezbollah and Israel, and how can peace be reached in the Middle East? Well, for more, I'm joined by the former UK Member of Parliament who has twice held ministerial positions in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State from 2010 to 2013 and as Minister of State for the Middle East from 2017 to 2019, Alistair Burt. Mr. Burt, good of you to make time for us. And given your wealth of experience of the region, what has it been like there in the UK watching events unfold in the Middle East, not only over the course of the last year, but certainly in the last fortnight with the ratcheting up in tensions?
Well, thank you, Rosanna, for asking. It's been very despairing. Those of us who have spent some time on this over the years know that you could have asked your question about the events of last week, last year, the events of the last 10 years, the events of the last 30 years. The despairing thing is that it just goes on. I think in reaction to very recent events, I'd say two things. Firstly, the polarization in the United Kingdom is as great as I can recall it, in that it is very difficult for people to express empathy for all victims, expressing empathy for those who were caught up in the atrocity of October the 7th, the attack by Hamas, and expressing sympathy for the victims of the reprisals in Gaza and now Lebanon is very difficult, because you're almost forced to take one side or the other. To express empathy for one is to be assumed to be supporting them against the other. So there's that sense of polarization, which is much greater. I think, secondly, the events of the last week have heightened the tension in relation to Lebanon. We know it was always the intention of some in Israel to pursue Hezbollah in the same way as Hamas because of the threat posed to Israel. And the rhetoric from Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN and the actions of Israel in the last couple of weeks would suggest that Israel has taken a decision that it is time to tackle Hezbollah and seek a military victory instead of the diplomatic relationship and end of the conflict that so many others are urging upon all sides in the region.
Indeed, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the UN General Assembly on Friday and saying that his country, Israel, is seeking peace, that he wasn't even considering attending UNGA because of the state of his country being at war, but saying he needed to set the record straight against the, quote, slander and lies that he believes that Israel has faced over the course of the last year. In terms of that message getting through, him feeling like he has successfully set the record straight regards Israel, do you think people will be sympathetic to that, given that some people actually began walking out during the start of his address?
No, I don't think he'll be successful in that because, as I said earlier, this is a completely polarized situation. Those who do not want to listen to Israel and its explanation as what has happened over the past year will not listen. Those who believe that only Israel is telling the truth will not need to be further convinced. But it's landing nowhere in terms of those who want to understand the background to the situation and whether or not there is any way forward. All people see is these two sides deeply polarized with no opportunity to talk in the middle. And that's very worrying because you always need a place to begin to talk to sides involved in a conflict to see if there's any way in which the conflict can be brought to an end without further confrontation. In my experience in the region over the years, very little has been solved by military activity. Look at Iraq, look at Syria, the continuing war in Yemen. Nothing gets resolved if it's purely military because the problems remain. So Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement of belief about Israel, and as he said, putting his side's case, will largely have fallen on deaf ears because those who have listened were already convinced, and those who walked out and those who stayed but don't believe him will not be convinced.
And look, Israel saying before they began, during their military action over Lebanon over the past week, that they waited for diplomatic solutions, that they've tried. But obviously there has been cross-border fire between Hezbollah and Israel over the course of the last year that just hasn't stopped. So they felt like military action was the only solution at this point. Can you understand it?
Yes, I can. These issues go back a long time, fundamentally about, in Hezbollah's case, their absolute refusal to accept the existence of the State of Israel because of the way in which Hezbollah came together, and their belief that it is their mission to seek to destroy Israel. Israel was shaken beyond all understanding by the events of October the 7th and the attack by Hamas. It's completely traumatized the state. It's changed. October the 7th has changed everything in the region. And the determination of Israel to prevent Hezbollah mounting a similar attack in northern Israel has led to the evacuation of that land. And this is seen by Israel as a national insult. Why should its people be forced to live elsewhere? That is how it sees it. Hence the determination to take action, which I think has now reached a critical point.
What about the proportionality of the response? I know we've discussed it a lot over the last year, since October 7th, that Israel has a right to defend itself, but the proportionality has moved the dial too far in the other direction. The volume of civilian casualties and injuries that we've witnessed in Gaza, the conflict that we're now seeing happening in Lebanon as well. Do you think Israel still has a sense of proportionality?
I don't, because we take a fundamentally different view on this. Israel believes that that anything is legitimate in pursuit of those who commit terror against it and those that it accuses of genocide against the Jewish people. And it's said very clearly, if it targets terrorists and they are surrounded by others, by innocent civilians, they will blame the terrorists for surrounding themselves with those civilians, but Israel will strike. Now, to many of the rest of us, the numbers of those killed in Gaza, and estimates, as you are aware, Rosanna, go way beyond the 40,000 that's been already reported. There could be at least double that. Who knows how many are under the rubble? To many others, this seems disproportionate. Above all, in the Arab world, it seems disproportionate. What has happened is Hamas has succeeded out of its atrocity in gaining the sympathy of those who wish to see resistance to Israel. And Israel, having suffered this appalling moral blow against it, is now seen as the perpetrator of criminality in the way in which it has executed its reprisals. This is an extraordinary situation, but it just demonstrates there is no success here. There is no victory for anyone, and the numbers of those killed, the generational impact this will have. Because for the orphans there, maybe 15, 17,000, the tradition has been in over the past decades, those orphans will likely be looked after either by Hamas or Hezbollah or those who will fund them. And what will they do when they grow up? Unless there is a diplomatic solution to this, which involves all the states in the region, including the Arab states, which have reached out to each other, to Israel and to Iran in recent times to try and find a different Middle East. Unless that succeeds, then these conflicts will be endless and they will be worse.
I want to come back to progress or lack of in terms of diplomatic solution, but just talk for a moment about, I think something that you touched on that we can talk about a bit more is the information warfare side of this and the perceptions of both Hamas in Gaza but also Israel over the last year and how that's been shifted by accusations of slander, as we've already discussed, polarization you've mentioned, but also just sheer discrediting of facts. I spoke to a Deputy National Security Advisor for Israel recently who said that claims of starvation in Gaza of late have been fabricated. It's not true. The military action on the ground by Israel hasn't been that intense. It's just not as horrible as the media and various voices are making out. And on the other side of things, you hear other types of discrediting information against Israel, and Israel saying, look, we've become a victim in all of this as well in terms of public perception. How fair do you think it is of people to basically say that Israel has become a cruel fighter in all of this?
It's almost impossible to disentangle. Israel is hampered by the fact that it has not allowed independent media into Gaza. So the information that's come out of Gaza is either from it itself or from Palestinian embedded journalists who've lived in Gaza, or indeed the figures we've seen from the health ministry, which is run by the Hamas authorities. So Israel has hampered itself in trying to let anybody see exactly what goes on. Secondly, we do live in a world of disinformation. It began right at the beginning. If you remember, there was an explosion at a hospital fairly shortly after Israel began its efforts against Hamas. This was immediately blamed on Israel, that it had deliberately targeted this hospital. It turns out that most experts believe this wasn't the case. It was a misfired rocket by Hamas. Nonetheless, the story was already out there. Those involved in the conflict have no interest in delivering the truth, so they will inevitably colour all incidents one way or another. What we do know is shocking enough. We know that Hamas executed recently 6 hostages in a tunnel, causing no risk to any of their captors, but they were cruelly murdered. We know that thousands of women and children have been killed in bombing raids in Gaza. We already know all this. We know that the pagers that went off in Lebanon were so primed that they required someone to pick them out of their pocket and look at them before they exploded. These are horrific incidents, and to try and create a situation where you will get people to live in peace with each other after these events have occurred, and there are worse, is very difficult. And the disinformation is part of it. I think, honestly, it is very hard to disentangle. I think there has been wrong and evil on both sides. And I don't think it's unfair both to condemn the atrocity of October the 7th by Hamas and also condemn the nature of the reprisals that Israel has taken.
And look, the polarisation that you touched on before, I think, is very interesting when we consider the effect it has on the way people perceive foreign powers, but also their own governments. You and I are both from the United Kingdom, where there was a general election earlier this summer, and Gaza actually played a big role in the election campaign and the way people were thinking and voting. We saw candidates having to remove themselves from the race because of it. Ultimately, of course, the election wasn't probably decided on the Middle East, but it had an impact. So regarding the US election that's upcoming, how big an impact do you think what's happening in the Middle East is it going to have on whether people decide to vote for Trump or Harris on voting day?
Good question, Rosanna. In the United Kingdom, there was a limited impact, but a significant one. 5 seats that the Labour Party, the governing party now, that would have expected to win in that general election, were in fact won by independents, and independents standing in largely Muslim areas on a platform supporting what was the actions of those who were resisting Israel in Gaza, and very volubly. In the United States, where Gaza and this conflict will not decide the whole election, the issue will be in marginal states. But we all understand the American process means that maybe 5 states, and within those 5 states, maybe a few 100,000 votes within those states will determine the election. Now, when you look at the Arab American population in some areas, Jewish population in others, then clearly there will be an impact. And people are assuming that that the Democrats may suffer from Arab Americans not supporting Kamala Harris because of the United States' position, Joe Biden's position on Gaza. So it could be significant.
And I hope you don't mind me asking, because I know obviously, you might not want to take a position on this, but in terms of who does enter the White House, do you think it will be better for Middle East tensions and geopolitics at large, whether it is Harris or Trump in there?
Well, you're quite right. I'm hesitant as a UK, even a UK former politician to get into this area. In that the United Kingdom will work with whoever wins. And there are different voices in the Middle East. To answer your question directly, I know some in the Middle East who believe that the Democrat support for the region since the time of President Obama has been very mixed. They look at the decision in relation to Syria, the red line that was supposed not to be crossed in terms of chemical attack by President Assad. When there was no action from the United States. There was no action from the United States when the Houthi missiles hit Aramco in Saudi Arabia and the airports in the UAE. And there have been question marks about the United States position for some time. There are those who believe that President Trump's particular style and the fact that it's so uncertain what he might do would actually require others to consider very carefully what their actions would be. There are others who believe that his unstinting support for Israel and his determination to pull the United States out of the nuclear deal with Iran, which limited Iran's nuclear process, the pulling out of which I regard as disastrous, encouraged by Prime Minister Netanyahu, means that his actions in relation to that could be considered more hazardous to the region. It's an open question. I'm not sure anyone outside America has got a point of view that's more valid than the electorate in America. They will decide these things, but either candidate will face a difficult situation in the Middle East and not the easiest of legacies of the United States up to now.
Look, that's a fair response to a question of international diplomacy there between the UK and the US. But in terms of the role that the UK does indeed play on the global stage, you know, we've been hearing the same lines out of the UK government from last week that you would expect when you have a flare-up in tensions, which is urging for restraint, de-escalation, not in anyone's interest, etc. Does it actually make a difference?
It makes a difference, the United Kingdom acting in accordance with others. Does it make a difference in what the United Kingdom thinks on its own? No, broadly it doesn't. We're not the greatest influence in the region. But when we have a voice with the dozen others or so who signed the statement the other day, the United States, France, Germany, when the United Kingdom is acting in concert with its former European partners in the European Union, that makes a difference. And that's important so that people know where the United Kingdom stands. We still have effective resources in the area. People will recall that in April, when Iran launched a missile barrage against Israel, United Kingdom forces were deployed to help defend Israel against those missiles. So we're still a force in the area. But more than anything, we're a diplomatic force. And I've long argued since the start of the conflict, or the most recent element of this conflict from last October, that the United Kingdom could play a stronger convening role. We all know that this won't be settled unless there is a comprehensive solution to the issues involving the Palestinian people. We've heard just in the last few days, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear there is no normalization with Israel unless there is a Palestinian state. No mincing of words there. And in order to get there, there's got to be a consideration of the occupation on the West Bank, which has to come to an end, the situation in East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza, and a resolution in relation to Lebanon. This can only be done by diplomacy, and the United Kingdom can play a key part in bringing together those who must want to see an end to this. And the other question will be Iran. What the future Iran sees both for itself and the region. A situation in which there is continuing conflict which is laid at its door because of its support of various proxy groups. That is not a good recipe for peace in the future either.
I'm glad you brought the conversation back to diplomatic solutions for what's currently happening, because you wrote an article recently that caught our eye about how something positive could emerge from the Israel-Hamas war. Could you expand on that for our viewers?
Yes, I said it seemed incongruous to suggest that anything good can come out of it, but I took the view that everything has changed since October the 7th. There is no going back ever to October the 6th, which was a false status quo. Israel believed the issue of the Palestinian people could be managed. That view was shared by a number of states in the region who believed that they could make a relationship with Israel more formal than it had been without the Palestinian issue being settled. And that is now comprehensively not the case. And as well as the situation in Gaza, as I indicated a moment ago, there is no resolution of Gaza without a resolution in relation to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. No one is going to rebuild Gaza and put significant amounts of money into it if it's going to be bombed to bits again in 3 years' time. And my other reason for hope was that in the couple of years leading up to October the 7th, there were great efforts being made in the Middle East to end regional rivalries. Iran was talking to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. friends were talking in a way they hadn't done before. There was this process of believing that Israel could be brought into the economy of the region to the benefit of all. Saudi Arabia has its Vision 2030. Most of the Gulf states have their visions. None of this can be delivered if there is to be a conflict. Accordingly, everything suggests that the conflict has to come to an end. There has to be a comprehensive settlement. And just maybe the events of October the 7th and subsequent are so dreadful, and with the possibility of war in Lebanon increasing, when this ends, it's got to end once and for all. And there's got to be an opportunity taken for the comprehensive agreement that so many people believe must happen.
And assuming that you are still a supporter of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, do you feel that we're some way closer to that at the moment, or further, given the expanse of your career and what you've seen?
Rosanna, I think you could have a handful of guests on and we'd probably all say something different. The short answer to your question is, I don't know. I do believe at the moment the level of trust between peoples who are living in proximity to each other is such that imagining people actually living next door to each other without some form of secure border or defense between them seems very difficult. The degree of trust that was lost by the attack on October the 7th throughout Israel was enormous, and that trauma has not been repaired. Equally, when you see what is happening in Gaza, the idea that people could all live together in one state seems to me very difficult. Having said that, I've heard growing, particularly Palestinian voices saying, no, two-state is not right, it must be one state, in which the Jewish people are free to live. But it's not necessarily a Jewish state. It's a state for all of us who have claims to the land. Now, trying to disentangle that, I don't know. Ultimately, I think where people outside should work towards is self-determination for the Palestinian people. Eventually, people in the region, they've got to decide for themselves what it is they want to have as their form of governance. It's no longer going to be decided by some great conference in Vienna or Paris or London or New York. This will be decided regionally. The region is very different to how it was in 67 or 2006 or other significant years. The region will make decisions here, and the Palestinian people and self-determination, I think, is an important part of it. But what the end state of governance will be, I'm not sure at the moment anyone can say. But if it's not going to be two-state, I'd need some convincing about how a one-state solution would work.
Former UK Member of Parliament, former Minister of State for the Middle East, Alistair Burt, it's been great having your time and your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.